The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello?
Sorry for the technical difficulties. We're checking now to make sure everybody can hear us all right. We welcome you to 1000 Friends of Florida's latest webinar, An Ongoing Crisis and Emerging Solution. We have applied for 1.5 AICPCM credits for planners and CLE credits by the Florida Bar. These typically take several weeks to come through, so we will be posting them on our site when they do come through. Also, if you're interested in looking at this PowerPoint, it's available for downloading on our website at 1000friendsoflorida.org. You can go to the website, and on the right there's a scrolling What's New panel, and if you look at that, it will have the PowerPoint for this webinar. Just a little bit about 1000 Friends of Florida before we get started. We're a statewide nonprofit membership organization. We focus on saving special places, fighting sprawl, and building better communities. We encourage you to stay informed in what we do. You can sign up for email alerts and you'll get information on our webinars and other information. You can also follow us on Facebook and Twitter. The webinars are in honor of Dr. John M. DeGrove, who was known widely as the father and grandfather of growth management, father in Florida and grandfather for the many other states that he worked with to establish growth management programs. And we've done this in his honor and memory. We have a whole slate of upcoming free webinars planned on September 18th. It's going to be on watershed planning, lessons learned from Florida Springs, October 9th on landscaping and biodiversity, November 13th, transportation mobility systems, and December 11th, Florida greenways and trails. You can register by clicking on the link, or again, if you go to our main page at 1000friendsoflorida.org, under What's New, there's also information on the webinars there. I wanted to direct your attention, you all have a control panel, and it includes a questions box. As we go through the presentation, please feel free to type in any questions you have, and if possible, refer to the slide number when you post your question. We will monitor the questions and we'll ask them at the end as time permits. Charles Pattison is now going to talk about the presenter.
Thanks, Vivian. This is Charles Pattison. I'm the president for the 1000 Friends of Florida, and it's our pleasure today to have a very interesting discussion with the Everglades Foundation about the current situation in the Everglades. Unfortunately, Eric Eichenberg, the CEO for the Everglades Foundation, and Dawn Sheriffs, the new senior policy advisor, had a last-minute conflict and won't be able to join us, but we're very fortunate, though, to have Dr. Stephen Davis III with us today. He is the wetland ecologist with the Everglades Foundation. He has a bachelor's degree in biology and environmental science from Georgetown College, a master's degree in biological and environmental science from Morehead State University, and his doctorate from the Florida International University. He is a wetland ecologist for the foundation, and that means he has continued his extensive work on wetland research that dates back more than a decade. Most recently, he was a assistant and associate professor at Texas A&M University for 8 years, and he continues to work now on Everglades research projects relating to mangrove wetland biogeochemistry and carbon dynamics. So it's our pleasure to welcome Dr. Davis, and I'll turn the program over to him.
Thank you, Charles and Vivian. Really appreciate the opportunity to give this presentation to the group today. I would like to apologize that my colleagues, as you mentioned, weren't able to make it today. They are in Fort Myers this morning. As some of you may know or have heard, the governor will be announcing an investment in Everglades restoration at the tune of about $30 million a year for the next 3 years for the next phase of Tamiami Trail bridging. And this might seem quite a distance from some of the issues we're experiencing in Lake Okeechobee with the regulatory discharges today. But the solution, as I'll talk with you about in my presentation to this problem, really begins at the bottom, and it's pulling the drain out of the tub, so to speak, so that we can move water south and flow it through the ecosystem. I want to point out our website. If you have an opportunity to take this down, maybe you've seen our site already, evergladesfoundation.org. We have a lot of information related to some of the different Everglades restoration projects, some of which I'll talk about today, and also to point you to another website, a more recently released website associated with the regulatory discharges, saveourrivers.com, and I can provide that link to Vivian via email. She'll provide that to you hopefully as soon as we're finished. I want to talk a little bit about the organization itself. We're a small science-based environmental organization focused on protecting and restoring the Everglades ecosystem, really from top to bottom. So from the Kissimmee down through Lake Okeechobee, the northern estuaries, the water conservation areas, Everglades National Park, etc., down to Florida Bay and the Florida Keys. And we really engage everyone from policymakers, opinion leaders, business leaders in the community, and try to educate them about the importance of protecting and restoring the ecosystem. A lot of it is about the fact that it's our water supply. Also, as many of you probably know, that our economy is directly tied to the health of the Everglades, in addition to the environmental aspects that many of us enjoy. And we partner with a number of academic institutions to continue our research that relates to the Everglades. We partner with local, state, federal agencies in terms of restoration planning, and also just from an oversight perspective. So we involve ourselves at a number of different levels scientifically, but we also have a number of environmental partners, different organizations such as Thousand Friends of Florida, National Park Conservation Association, Sanibel Captiva Conservation Foundation. These groups we partner with to really spread our impact in focusing those efforts on all aspects of the Everglades ecosystem. And we do that through regular planning calls and meetings, and also through funding. We provide resources to these groups as well. This is just a screen capture of our website from this morning, and based on the governor's release of information later on this morning, we'll see this website change throughout the course of the day. I encourage you to take a look at that. Again, getting back to the fact that the Everglades is our water supply, this is one of our most important messaging points statewide. Whether or not you actually get out in the Everglades, people need to understand that the aquifer that the Everglades recharges and has recharged historically provides us with our water supply for the 6 to 7 million people that live in the Everglades region, South Florida Water Management District. So this is effectively 1 out of every 3 Floridians that's dependent upon a healthy Everglades for their water supply. But we know that this has changed, and largely because of the development that's taken place over the last century and the attempts to drain the Everglades that took us from this pre-drainage scenario where water flowed down the Kissimmee Valley into Lake Okeechobee, overspilled the lake in the wet season to the south and the southwest. But we also know that we had some easterly flow coming out of the ecosystem into the Atlantic. If we compare that to the system today, we can see that, first of all, that water that comes down the Kissimmee no longer moves to the south. In fact, much of it goes out the Caloosahatchee to the west and the St. Lucie to the east, leaving just the southernmost extreme regions, Everglades National Park, Florida Bay, etc., that are really driven more by local precipitation and runoff. And as you can see, those areas don't receive as much water as they did historically. You can also see with the flood control system that we currently have, there's a lot more water moving to the southeast and then to the east. And I think we need to really just look at satellite imagery to get a picture of why this has taken place. And obviously this wasn't a satellite image here on the left. This is our best depiction of what South Florida looked like from above before we drained the ecosystem. And you can see this massive open flowing ecosystem to the south and the southwest. These whitish areas along the coast represent the Atlantic coastal ridge. This is the high ground in South Florida and the area that was first developed. Compare that to the situation we have today, you can see that that development has expanded greatly westward, impinging upon what was the historic Everglades ecosystem. And as I mentioned earlier, it was the development, the agricultural and urban development that ultimately led to the need for a flood control water supply project that became known as the Central and South Florida Project. And the thing to keep in mind is that this infrastructure, the way we currently manage water in the system, where we have those massive regulatory releases out the Caloosahatchee and St. Lucie, the system was designed to work this way. That is the most efficient way of getting water off the landscape, that water that we know used to flow through the Everglades to the south and the southwest. Currently supports about 7 million people, as I mentioned earlier, and the system was designed for roughly 2 million, and it's still providing services in the area of water supply and flood control for South Florida. And we know it's this infrastructure, this system of canals and levees and pumps that led to an ecological collapse across the ecosystem, most notably about a 90% loss of wading birds ecosystem-wide. While we have a plan to fix this, as a result of the Water Resources Development Act, or WRDA, in 2000, the Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan, or CERP, was put into action. And I'll talk about this a little bit more, but I want to just jump back to the two major issues that we talk about with regard to Everglades restoration. One is water quantity. This is a picture of the St. Lucie Lock, the S80. You can see the massive discharges of fresh water coming out of the lake that we've experienced over the past month. Imagine this water flowing to the south from Lake Okeechobee over a length of tens of maybe 50 miles wide. So this water would naturally spread out across the landscape as sheet flow. And here, because of the way we manage the system through gates, culverts, confined channels, we see these massive whitewater plumes coming out. While we know that that water is also polluted, we have a water quality problem in addition to a water quantity problem. And so if you fly over these estuaries, either the Caloosahatchee or the St. Lucie at this point in time, you can see the dark stained water. Some of that is from the high organic matter content of the water, but we also know that some of it is derived as a result of the nitrogen and phosphorus pollution that this water contains that ultimately leads to algae blooms in our estuaries and receiving water bodies. So those are the two big issues, and we need to recognize that that water historically flowed to the south. And since WRDA 2000, we've learned a lot about the ecosystem. One of the biggest things and most important things that we've learned is that there was more water in the Everglades to the south of Lake Okeechobee than we previously thought. And this illustration with the red line shows you just a reference point, a transect, if you will, as a measure of how much water used to flow across that boundary into the Everglades. And this graphic here is in tens of acres of feet of water. If we look at the yellow line, that's where we are currently from a month-to-month basis. A total of about 1.4 million acre-feet per year, with the bulk of that we know occurring during the wet season that we're in right now. The Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan in blue really sought to bring more water back into the ecosystem, particularly during the dry season when it was impacted most through soil drying and oxidation, loss of habitat, etc. Compare that to what we know with the natural systems model now of what the historical system looked like at about 2.1 million acre-feet per year that would have moved across this red transect. And that gives you an idea of the magnitude of difference between where we are currently and what the system was historically. And it's important to note that this water, this high peak here, is the water that's currently going out the Caloosahatchee and St. Lucie River. And we also know that in addition to the water quality impacts that are being faced in those estuaries today, that same water quality impacts the marsh further south in the Everglades. This is an illustration that depicts natural Everglades habitat on the left in a low nutrient natural state relative to a degraded or phosphorus polluted state. This is a situation that we see expanding adjacent to canals and near agricultural areas. Compare that with the natural system that is a very diverse ridge and slough habitat where we have higher elevation sawgrass ridges and deeper sloughs that are characterized by periphyton, a diversity of large and small fish, frogs, floating aquatic plants, etc., as opposed to the cattail dominated state that's mostly comprised of smaller fish. And we've done a lot of really good science over the last decade that's fed us this kind of information and gave us the understanding of how the ecosystem changes as we load more and more phosphorus into it. And we know that the first changes to take place are that the periphyton mats begin to disappear. And it's important to note that periphyton is the base of the Everglades food chain. So when we add phosphorus to the Everglades, we lose the periphyton. We lose the base of the food chain of the ecosystem. And through time and continuous loading of phosphorus, we begin to see the appearance of green algae. We begin to see the appearance of cattail in more dense clusters, loss of large fish, an increase in smaller fish, and an overall change in the landscape pattern. And this can occur over a period of a week to 2 weeks, all the way up to a year to several years. And the South Florida Water Management District has done a really good job of tracking these impacts ecosystem-wide. And this is just an example of some of the maps that they generate to show the increase in cattail over time. And this particular map goes from 1991 to 2003. And the thing to point out is the increase in the yellow, orange, and red areas, particularly adjacent to the canals that border Water Conservation Area 2A. And the numbers down here in this table just reflect the increase in cattail area from 1991 to 1995. We saw an increase of almost 4,000 hectares. And 1 hectare, it's important to point out, is about 2.5 acres. So if you multiply these values by 2.5, you can get the net change in, or net increase in cattail across these periods of mapping. So we're seeing the increasing continue. Our solution to removing phosphorus before it enters the Everglades ecosystem is through stormwater treatment areas. Some of you, I'm sure, know about this particular tool already. These are engineered wetlands designed solely for the purpose of removing nutrients, and in this case phosphorus. As water is introduced at one end, we see almost a fertilizer effect on the plant growth. Phosphorus is taken up by the plants and roots, stored in the plant tissue, or it's accumulated in the soil, and as that water passes through the wetland, it's progressively cleaner to the point where at the outflow it is then ready for flowing into the Everglades protection area. This map shows the Everglades agricultural area just south of Lake Okeechobee, with the existing stormwater treatment areas 1 east, 1 west, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, in addition to an increased infrastructure that will result as the restoration strategies plan is implemented. These flow equalization basins identified here with FEB and some of these new STAs and STA expansions will be needed to clean the water sufficiently to meet the standard for flowing into the Everglades, and that is what is referred to as a 10 part per billion standard. 10 parts per billion phosphorus relative to water is what's needed to maintain the health and integrity of Everglades marsh. So that's what's necessary to prevent the conversion of sawgrass marsh to cattail and to prevent the loss of periphyton in the ecosystem. This is just a photo showing what one of these areas of the stormwater treatment area actually looks like. And the thing to point out is that this infrastructure, the flow equalization basins and stormwater treatment areas, are needed to treat the existing flow of water that runs off the Everglades agricultural area into the water conservation areas. This will not allow us to bring new water down, as in the Central Everglades Planning Project. So all new restoration that brings flow south from Lake Okeechobee will require new storage and treatment features in addition to these that I've identified on this map. So getting back to the question, how do we fix a broken system? How do we get from something that functioned like that natural system back to where it was, but recognizing that we're not going to see mass exodus from South Florida? Millions of people aren't going to be leaving anytime soon. So we're working with the footprint that we have, the infrastructure that we have, the situation that we currently have with the Everglades agricultural area that is essentially a divide between the Everglades and its headwater supply. Well, again, getting back to the Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan, we have a long-term solution to do that. But in the short term, our responses are quite limited. You've probably heard about basin storage, storing water temporarily on lands as a way of preventing those massive pulse releases out to the estuaries. The reality is this isn't going to change significantly the duration of those events. It might buy a few days or a few weeks, and I know in some cases that's critical. But from year to year and looking at it from the big picture perspective, we need longer term significant steps towards restoring the system and moving that water south. So there's really nothing that we can implement within the next 6 months that will change the situation. And so we need to be looking at those long-term solutions. And I've got a map here just identifying what those big solutions are. And the biggest issue is that we need a new outlet southward from the lake. I'll talk about the Central Everglades Planning Project shortly. And that's really our first big step at moving water to the south. There's also the local basin storage and treatment, particularly the C43 and C44 reservoirs, in addition to the other Indian River Lagoon South projects. So again, I mentioned that the Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan was launched in 2000. The Central Everglades Planning Project is a partial implementation of SERP projects. About 5 SERP projects that were identified of the 68 are being considered as per the SEP planning process. This diverts water again to the south that would have otherwise been regulatory released out the Caloosahatchee and St. Lucie estuaries. As I mentioned earlier, that any new water that comes to the south needs to be cleaned. In addition to the existing infrastructure, new storage and treatment features need to be added to move more water to the south. So that's an important limiting factor with restoration and moving water south. So the Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan was released in 2000. It's important to recognize that we're now towards the end of 2013, and there's been a lot of science that has occurred since that period in time. So we've learned a lot about the Everglades ecosystem since 2000. We've had hurricanes, we've had droughts, we've had fires, we've had other disturbances and impacts to the ecosystem, massive releases from Lake Okeechobee, continuing phosphorus pollution ecosystem-wide. And so over that period of time, we haven't just been sitting back as scientists twiddling our thumbs. We've actually been studying the ecosystem and learning a lot about different performance measures in the system that provide the best indication of performance and also allow us to assess the performance of Everglades restoration. So we've identified a set of performance measures that we've applied from the Kissimmee, across the lake, the northern estuaries, down through the southern Everglades that allow us to really understand the ecosystem. These performance measures are science-based indicators of attributes, just like your pulse and your temperature is an indicator of your health. We've identified these across the Everglades ecosystem, and we can set them as targets for desired conditions within the system. And just an example of some of the performance measures that we've identified for the Caloosahatchee and St. Lucie rivers, they include things like salinity, the water quality, the oyster habitat, the submerged aquatic vegetation. Further south in the Everglades, we've identified really good relationships between the hydrology and the performance of the Everglades snail kite, the hydrology and the performance of ridge and slough habitat that I'll describe in a few minutes. So these are robust indicators of performance in the system, and they're also, because of the science, the investment in time and money, they've refined them to the point where they're really feasible to go out and implement. So again, the Central Everglades Planning Project is SERP, but the key is that since the 1999 plan that was in the WRDA 2000, we've updated it with new science, new information, new modeling tools that allow us to evaluate different restoration scenarios and screen options much more efficiently. This process has also been very successful from the perspective of involving the public and stakeholders from the very beginning. And ultimately, the result is what we currently have, a tentatively selected plan and a draft project implementation report that the South Florida Water Management District Governing Board recently signed off on. It's also important to note that this plan, rather than taking a typical 6 to 7 years to produce, has been produced in less than 2 years. So I'm going to go through, from a geographic perspective, the Central Everglades Planning Project. And here we're looking at it region by region. This is just south of the Everglades, or south of Lake Okeechobee in the Everglades agricultural area. And the goal here, again, is to move water south from the lake using the existing canal infrastructure and existing state-owned lands, the Talisman A1, A2 parcels. These will be used for storage and treatment basins. That water will flow through stormwater treatment areas. And the goal, as that water comes out of the agricultural area, is to introduce that water into Northern Water Conservation Area 3A in as natural a way as possible. And it was prioritized that that water should be moved to the northwestern end to achieve the maximum sheet flow length and also to hydrate an area that's been greatly impacted by overdrying and soil oxidation. So there's a feature to spread that water and distribute it westward, in addition to Miami Canal backfill all the way down to I-75. You can see there on the map. And so when that water is then introduced into the Northern Water Conservation Area 3A, the objective is to flow it in that most natural way to restore sheet flow and to restore lost habitat across that large area of Water Conservation Area 3A. Moving to the southern end, where we have the interface of Water Conservation Area 3A here, 3B here, and then Everglades National Park to the south of Tamiami Trail. At this point of the plan, we'll see the addition of new outlet structures so that we can relieve ponding that typically occurs in lower Water Conservation Area 3A. The depths of water down here get too great in the wet season. So by creating these divide structures, we can flow water, decompartmentalize the system, and relieve this ponding. Also, we'll see the removal of dams and levees, the L67A, or C, excuse me, the L29 down here along Tamiami Trail, and the L67 extension that goes down into Everglades National Park, with the construction of a feature that will allow for water to flow directly from Water Conservation Area 3A to 3B into Everglades National Park. In addition to the 1-mile Tamiami Trail bridge that we currently have, we'll see the construction of a new 2.6-mile bridge on Tamiami Trail. And referring back to my point earlier regarding Governor Scott's announcement today, those monies that he allocates in his budget will be used towards the construction of this bridge as a match towards the federal contribution. It's important to point out this is a non-SERP element, and so it's critical piece, though, for the Central Everglades Planning Project. And as with any Everglades restoration project, anytime we bring more water back into the ecosystem, and recognizing that we have development so close to this wetland, we need to be mindful of the seepage losses that occur and the increased flood risk that we cause. So there are seepage components in place that will prevent the loss of water that would contribute to flooding in these western Miami-Dade communities. And again, the goal is to receive that water flowing naturally from the northern end and flow it through the bottom end of the ecosystem. And this is really the critical element to moving water from the lake south. We need to pull the plug, and by creating more bridging and this flowway as a part of the Central Everglades Planning Project, we'll be able now to introduce more flow back into the ecosystem, back to the south, and relieve those harmful discharges to the northern estuaries. So I mentioned Everglades ridge and slough landscape earlier, and this is one of the things that by removing those barriers to flow, by decompartmentalizing the system, we hope to achieve the restoration of. And it's this patterned landscape where we have these high ridges of sawgrass interspersed with deeper areas of open water and floating aquatic plants and submerged aquatic plants. And considering the seasonal hydrology of the Everglades, when we go from the wet season where the ridges, the sloughs, everything are connected and underwater, and fish are growing in the marsh, they're growing in the slough, everything is spread out across the entire landscape. As we move into the dry season, that water compresses and concentrates food across the landscape to the point where you get isolated pools in the sloughs. This attracts wading birds and alligators and is the mechanism for concentrating prey items to move that energy up the food chain. This is how the Everglades works, and it really speaks to the importance of both a patterned landscape and a natural hydro period across the Everglades. We need to get the water right in addition to having the landscape right in order for the Everglades to work. If we look at this at a close-up scale, at the level of the marsh where we see the Sawgrass Ridge and the slough, as we move through the dry season, you can see that water depths and prey concentration get to a point where it's optimal for the highest diversity of wading bird community. And so this is what we aim for with Everglades restoration. We focus on the landscape as well as getting the water right. And I've picked out a couple of areas across the ecosystem that we use commonly as reference points for an indicator of landscape pattern health. And I've got an area identified here in Northwestern Water Conservation Area 3A, where the Central Everglades Planning Project is most focused in terms of introducing flow. The central part of Everglades Water Conservation Area 3A, Water Conservation Area 3B, and then Northeast Shark River Slough of Everglades National Park. And you may not be able to tell with these Google Earth images, but there's a pretty dramatic difference in terms of landscape patterning. And we use this area here in yellow as the reference point for what we consider to be healthy landscape pattern. And I've manipulated the coloring to black and white to show this more clearly. And what's happened in much of the ecosystem, it's either gotten too dry or too wet, and we've seen a loss of landscape patterning as a result. It just so happens that this yellow area is in a Goldilocks zone where it's not too wet and it's not too dry. So the landscape pattern that was there historically has been preserved, but we're still not flowing water in a way that helps to maintain that. And the reason why we've lost landscape patterns, so in addition to these areas perhaps that are too dry, where the soils have been exposed so long, we've seen essentially a decomposition of that organic muck. And in some cases, as you can see with this red zone in Northern Water Conservation Area 3A, we've seen a loss of more than 3 feet in soil elevation. So that is a massive amount of muck soil that's essentially disappeared and has been lost from the ecosystem. So that loss of soil elevation translates to a loss of landscape pattern. Compound that with a loss of tree islands across the entire water conservation area zone as well as Everglades National Park, and we've seen a dramatic reduction of habitat for transitional and upland species such as white-tailed deer, panther, etc. This map shows the loss of tree islands in red, areas where we've seen some slight gains in green, and then the yellow indicates no net change in terms of tree island area. These are data from the South Florida Water Management District. So the Central Everglades Plan, this is a product of a groundbreaking joint federal-state cooperative effort. Again, it's part of that comprehensive Everglades restoration plan. South Florida Water Management District has approved the draft. The focus now is on getting the Corps of Engineers to develop their final chiefs report to submit to Congress. We're currently in a 45-day, or will be as of this weekend, in a 45-day comment period for the draft PIR on the set plan. It's important to note that if we want to get this in the next Water Resources Development Act, we need to act quickly. The Senate has already passed their Water Resource Development Act, and the House will be taking this up very soon. This is a boat that we do not want to miss because we don't know when the next Water Resource Development Act will take place. It's also important to point out that chiefs reports for other key projects like C-43, Broward Water Preserve Areas, is also ready to be included in this next WRDA. So in addition to these SERP projects, I mentioned C43 already, there are these local basin SERP projects that are important components here that involve the lake, St. Lucie, and the Caloosahatchee. And as an example, the Indian River Lagoon South is a SERP project that's designed to control and treat local basin runoff. Many of you probably hear about the C44 components of the IRL South project. So this constructs new reservoirs and stormwater treatment areas, and this is a map showing the location. I'll focus on the C44 components of the reservoir and stormwater treatment area that will take water that's released down the C44 canal, move that into reservoir storage, treat that water, and then flow it out in a more natural, clean quality before it enters into the St. Lucie River. These projects will make significant improvements, but it's important to point out that they're not a final restoration solution, and this includes the Central Everglades Planning Project as well, because it's a partial implementation of 5 SERP projects. It's not a complete implementation. So this is what we need to be working on now, but we need to be mindful of longer-term solutions that involve additional lands in the EAA, particularly for storage and treatment of water, to allow us again to steer more of that water to the south, removing more of those barriers to flow. As we move more water down, we're going to have to bridge Tamiami Trail further, again removing that plug at the bottom of the system. And again, ensuring that there are no adverse effects to other water users. So I mentioned that we had both a water quantity and quality problem. Let's focus for a little bit on the water quality issue, because these issues occur both at the local basin level, when we think of the Caloosahatchee and St. Lucie, as well as the Lake Okeechobee Basin. It's important to point out that water quality is a state responsibility. State restoration strategies plan and their response to the federal litigation is an example of that. Well, if we look at a map of just the St. Lucie watershed itself, it contributes both water and nutrients to the estuary, to the river, to the estuary. When we add in discharges from Lake Okeechobee, we're essentially encompassing the Kissimmee River Basin as well. Obviously, this water is distributed from the Caloosahatchee as well as the St. Lucie. But it's important to keep in mind that we have these dual sources coming into the system. But if we look at it in terms of the distribution, contribution of both water and nutrients from the lake as well as the local basin, we see that the lake contributes about 42% of the water, whereas the local basin, St. Lucie, contributes about 58%. In terms of phosphorus, the lake's contributing about 24% of the phosphorus. The local basin contributes 76%. And in terms of nitrogen, it's a little more evenly split between the lake at 43% and the local basin at 57%. Well, there's been some past action to help deal with this, both at the local and regional scale. And I mentioned earlier the importance of scientific investigations, decades of research, millions of dollars that have been spent to understand and identify the impacts of nutrients and the sources of that pollution ecosystem-wide. The legislature passed the Lake Okeechobee Protection Act in 2000, the Lake Okeechobee Estuary Recovery Program in 2005, and these really set limits for phosphorus loads to the lake. Also led to protection plans for the estuaries, northern estuaries, and sets permit limits for lakes to be, for the total maximum daily load to be established by 2015. And the TMDL is 140 metric tons for phosphorus coming into the lake each year to achieve a concentration of about 40 parts per billion. And we're currently more than 2 times that typically in the lake today. So we've got a long way to go in terms of cleaning up that. We also saw the establishment of the Lake Okeechobee Trust Fund that was later rolled into the Everglades Forever. And in terms of watershed protection plans, if we focus on the Lake Okeechobee, we saw the Phase 2 technical plan in 2008, the Lake Okeechobee Protection Plan in 2011, and again, these spelled out the actions needed to achieve nutrient loading limits in the lake. For the St. Lucie and Caloosahatchee, we also have watershed protection plans and what are called BMAPs, Basin Management Action Plans. These are available on DEP's website and really provide important information on how to achieve long-term water quality goals. Just focusing on the Caloosahatchee considers both near-term and long-term issues. Agricultural best management practices are a component of this particular basin at $3 million cost estimate. Urban best management practices involving everything from fertilizer to urban runoff. You can see a much higher price tag associated with that. I mentioned the C43 project, the SERP project. This one is subjected to the federal-state partnership in addition to other non-SERP storage and treatment projects in that basin. Again, monitoring is a key aspect of any restoration project to ensure the success and track the progress of these efforts through time. And with the development of the performance measures that we have across the entire system, we can achieve that more efficiently. Revisions to rules associated with environmental resource permitting, etc. And then the SERP, again, SERP project, the C43 is cost shared. It's important to keep that in mind. Now, studies have been done with plans developed to address water quality problems. We have these again for the Caloosahatchee and the St. Lucie. These plans await implementation. They all essentially have the same basic elements. They involve best management practices in both the urban landscape as well as the agricultural landscape. They include storage and treatment components, whether associated with the Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan or not, and also monitoring, I mentioned earlier. And these are costly efforts, obviously. It's important to bear in mind that at a minimum, we're talking hundreds of millions of dollars for some of these efforts from either the near-term or long-term perspective. But the reality is that we know that our economy is directly tied to the health of the environment. And I've just pulled out a few examples to speak to that. Recreational fishing in Florida. This is a report that was just released. This is a $5 billion a year industry. We need healthy water, healthy, clean ecosystems in order to make recreational fishing as healthy as it is. Recreational boating is a $10 billion a year industry. Combined expenditures for recreational use in the Indian River Lagoon is about $3 billion a year. So this includes lodging, transportation, gear, etc. If we just focus in on Martin and St. Lucie County, this is about a $700 million per year expenditure. So that just that aspect of the Indian River Lagoon is almost a third. We take this down to the Florida Keys. Fishing in that region generates about $740 million a year. So we know that Everglades restoration, the health of our environment, is worth it in terms of these types of investments. When we compare the cost of the projects to the benefits, we know it's worth it as well. The Everglades Foundation commissioned an economic study to look at the benefits of restoration. And we found that for every dollar we invest in Everglades restoration, we get 4 at a minimum in return. And these are in areas of real estate, so in terms of property values. Talked about the importance of water supply earlier. We get significant return in terms of water supply. wildlife and hunting, fishing, open space, parks visitation, etc. Not to mention that more than 400,000 jobs are created. This was an analysis that looked at the comprehensive Everglades restoration plan. So if we implement that in its entirety, we know that we stand to gain benefits from that. And I think the same would apply from the local approaches as well. So in summary, the issues that we've talked about with regard to the Everglades, the lake, and the northern estuaries, they're both water quantity and water quality. Water quantity solutions, for the most part, are subjected to that joint federal-state partnership and the comprehensive Everglades restoration plan. Long-term solutions are things like CEP, C43, and C44. This will really move us forward in terms of cleaning up the water, regulating the flows, and moving that flow to the south. But the final fixes are going to require additional SERP projects that involve more storage and treatment and moving more water. Water quality solutions are primarily state and local issues. These are spelled out in those watershed protection plans that I talked about earlier. And these need implementation schedules and funding. And bottom line is we know it's worth it. Lastly, I want to point out a lot of this information that I've talked about is available in fact sheets on the Everglades Foundation's website, as well as the Protect Our Rivers website that I mentioned earlier, and that's indicated here at the bottom. We have fact sheets now for the C44 components of the Indian River Lagoon South, C43, Central Everglades Planning Project, in addition to numerous other project fact sheets on the Everglades Foundation's website. I encourage you to take a look at those. So again, I'll go back to the questions, instructions, and Vivian, if you have any comments, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. This is Vivian Young again from 1000 Friends of Florida. I wanted to remind you that you have a control panel that has a questions box on it. So if you do have any questions for Stephen, please type them in, and if possible include a slide number. And I'd like to start going over the questions. We do have a number of them that have come in already. One of them is, and I think you went over this early on, but some people might have checked in late, what are the immediate short-term plans to stem the flows out of Lake Okeechobee, and does Florida have any jurisdiction?
Well, pardon me here, I'm getting a note on the GoToWebinar. Cancel, okay. Really the short-term solutions that have been discussed, flooding lands in the EAA, temporary basin storage, moving water onto agricultural lands north of the lake. It's really a situation where we don't have a critical mass of land identified and infrastructure needed to do that. So what pieces that we could cobble together to do that really only buy us a matter of a few days in terms of curbing a flood pulse down the Caloosahatchee or the St. Lucie. So we're not buying ourselves much time in that regard. We need to think about big changes that involve moving water to the south.
Okay, we have another question, and this is regarding slide number 7. What is the influence of the Water Management District holding back water in the lakes in the upper basin? Will existing South Florida development be threatened by flooding if historic floods are now restored? Excuse me, historic flows are restored.
It would help if I could go back to earlier slides, but I'm afraid that it might.
I believe you can do that. Just go back.
Yeah.
There you go.
So, I'm sorry, can you repeat the question again?
Yes. What is the influence of the Water Management District holding back water in lakes in the upper basin on the historic seasonal water flow patterns? Will existing South Florida development be threatened by flooding if historic flows are restored?
Well, that's kind of a multifaceted question there, and so a lot of the water that reaches Lake Okeechobee, obviously there's a Lake Okeechobee regulation schedule that mandates criteria for regulatory releases, and so there's a little bit of flexibility that they have with regard to those releases, but we know that as lake stages get higher, particularly in the range of 16 to 17 feet, we know that we dramatically increase our risk of a breach of the dike. And so there would certainly be a risk of flooding to communities there. The dike repairs offer some solution, but then we have the ecology of the lake to concern ourselves with. Again, the solution, we need to keep in mind that we need to make those decisions regarding long-term planning today, because as we keep putting them off and trying to think about short-term quick fixes or band-aids to the system, we're not really going to achieve any progress in the long term.
Okay, we have another question about septic tanks. The 2.7 million septic tanks around Indian River Lagoon were cited as a major contributor to manatee deaths last week. Does the Everglades Foundation or 1,000 Friends feel that issue needs to be addressed, given that the legislature repealed septic tank inspection requirements in 2012?
I can't speak to that. You know, when you look at the sheer number of septic tanks in the system, relating that to manatee deaths, I think that the points that Brian LaPointe made at the Senator's Select Committee hearing recently were well-founded. I don't know if that direct connection's been made sufficiently, but I think it needs to be looked at further.
Okay. What impact did the legislature and governor's budget cuts that reduced staff at the water management districts have on the ability to regulate and monitor water quality in these regions?
Well, that's a good question. It certainly didn't affect their ability to regulate. The infrastructure that they have is critical to maintain and manage. Our water supply and flood control depend on that infrastructure. I think that we have seen cuts to funding for Recover, which is the significant monitoring arm of Everglades restoration, particularly in areas. One I can think of immediately is related to the monitoring of the crocodiles in Florida Bay. I know that there have been cuts to those budgets. I don't know how much of that was associated with cuts to the Water Management District's budget, though.
Okay. Another funding question. Are any funds coming from BP for work on the Everglades, or is it too far from the Gulf Coast to be eligible?
It is eligible, and we hope that a portion of those funds will be made available to improve conditions in our Gulf Coast estuaries.
Okay. We have another question. By increasing the sheet flow of water, are we reducing the habitat areas for the Florida panther?
Well, that's a good question. And what restoring sheet flow back to the system does is it creates that landscape patterning, the ridge and slough patterning that I talked about earlier. And granted, the ridges are typically underwater a few inches or so in wet season, and they're largely saturated, maybe with a little bit of water on top in the dry season. That's not panther habitat. If there's any panther habitat in the historic Everglades, it's on the tree islands, which we're losing also. We hope to learn more about tree island restoration. We've learned a lot about the ecology of the tree islands over the last decade. We still are learning about how to restore them. The Everglades probably wasn't a very hospitable place for panthers, particularly during the wet season, although we know that there are some around the entrance to the park and other areas within the Everglades today, and it might be an artifact of how dry it is. But we certainly need to keep that in mind.
Okay. We have another question. Traditionally, the Everglades agricultural area has been the main culprit for water quality degradation. However, with SERP implementation, is it possible that other sources, such as leaking septic tanks and or sewer, are a major contributor to water pollution? I think you addressed that earlier.
Yeah, we've, certainly in those basins, the Caloosahatchee and the St. Lucie, those local sources of nutrients are a big issue, and they're going to need to be dealt with. Further south in the Everglades protection area, we've identified the major sources of nutrients to that part of the system. The Everglades agricultural area is by far the largest. We have some other sources of nutrients from western Broward that will be dealt with as a result of the implementation of the Broward water preserve areas, and then also on the western side in the L28 basin that we need to be working on. But the Everglades agricultural area is the largest.
Okay, we have another question about there's been some recent discussion that suggests that the phosphorus requirement for the Everglades may be too low and in fact may starve the system of necessary nutrients. Do you have any comments on that?
Well, that isn't the case. We know that this is an area where we've invested a lot of resources and time in terms of research to understand the impacts of phosphorus on the system. And we know that subtle changes begin to take place in the periphyte mat before we even get to 10 parts per billion. So it's so finely tuned that as concentrations go from about 7 parts per billion up to 11 or 12 parts per billion, we begin to see changes take place in the periphyte mat. But that's a pretty narrow range, and naturally the system would vary between that. But we also know that as we move further downstream in the ecosystem, we see concentrations that are barely detectable, indicating that it's a low nutrient, low phosphorus environment and always has been.
Okay. Will today's announcement about Tamiami Trail provide any incremental relief to the St. Lucie and Caloosahatchee estuaries, or is this the same relief that's already expected from the Central Everglades Planning Project?
That is really the critical piece in getting SEP implemented. In fact, it depends, in addition to the C43 components and C44 components and some other pieces of SERP, it depends on this 2.6 mile bridge to move forward. And again, it all comes down to removing that plug in the bottom of the system in order to move more flow south. The SEP infrastructure in itself, we learned through the modeling and the screening, is capable of moving more water. So once we get SEP implemented with the 2.6 mile bridge, as we incrementally increase our storage and treatment capacity in the EAA, we can flow more water through that infrastructure.
Okay. What can local and state organizations do to move government forward more quickly on all of this?
I would say at the local level, take action on these watershed protection plans and moving forward with local and regional efforts to improve water quality in those basins. At the state level, I think we need to continue focusing on these projects. The big projects that move water south are those that are going to put us in the right path.
Okay, I'm paraphrasing here, but there are a number of projects in the SERP Central Everglades Restoration Plan. And what is the Everglades Foundation's opinion about prioritizing the many projects that are part of this project?
Well, those that have chief's reports, in addition to the SEP plan that we hope to have a chief's report on soon, those are the sort of projects that we want to see move forward. And we know that in order to get the benefits that were identified in the SEP planning and screening depend on these other projects being in place. So we want to see them implemented in as timely a fashion as possible.
Okay. Do we know when and how agencies may be soliciting farmers for water storage options on their land? Would this be science-based or first come, first serve?
I don't know the answer to that question.
Okay.
I hope that it's science-based.
Okay. Are there options being explored at the present time on this?
I don't know.
Okay. What are your recommendations with the issue of water quantity and quality entering Lake Okeechobee via the Kissimmee from the northern country basins?
Well, my opinion is that as we implement Kissimmee River restoration, as we can move more water out onto the floodplain, and at the same time trying to place more emphasis on best management practices, we can achieve something that is closer to the TMDL for the lake.
Okay. Another person says that they understand why it's important to filter any water flowing south. Why is it okay not to filter the water being sent east and west, which has escalated the pollution of rivers, estuaries, and the Atlantic Ocean and Gulf of Mexico?
Well, those projects, the C-44 as an example, involves a filtration component and involves stormwater treatment. And so there's a recognition there that something needs to be done, not only to store the water, but also to clean it. Even if there is not a specific treatment component, storing water typically cleans it somewhat because you get a settling of particles that are often phosphorus containing. So there's a water quality benefit of just holding on to that water for a period of time.
Okay. Is the ecological damage from the discharge equally serious on both the east and west coasts? And if not, is it feasible to shift some discharge to minimize total damage?
I'm not qualified to answer that. Both of those estuaries are just being hammered right now, and I think anyone that lives near those regions can speak to that better than I could. In terms of saying that one's being hit harder than the other, I can't say.
Okay. Do you have any information on the existing and projected damage to the lagoon and the St. Lucie County beaches and ocean?
I've worked in estuaries for close to 2 decades now, and one thing I know is that they are resilient ecosystems. When they receive this kind of pounding from year to year, you don't get very good recovery of seagrass and oyster habitat. But if left for a year or two of normal, and that's quote-unquote normal conditions, estuaries will recover. And we see that time and time again. We just had an algae bloom in Biscayne Bay, probably one of the worst that's ever been documented, worse than the one that followed Hurricane Andrew. And it's almost dissipated throughout the bulk of Biscayne Bay because it's an estuary and it's really well flushed. And you know, this is bad right now, and we're losing fish, we're losing habitat, we're losing recreational opportunities. But these are resilient ecosystems, and if we can ever get the water right, the hope is that we can restore them back to what they once were.
Okay. We have several questions about fertilization. How much does landscape fertilization contribute to the problem? And can the state ban the practice? And what about loopholes in the new Florida-friendly fertilizer rules?
That's a good question. Local use of fertilizers is a significant problem. And I think that some of the recent decision making has made it a little easier for, I guess, less easy, more difficult for municipalities to regulate use of fertilizer. I think that's an issue that we need to deal with soon, because it's a big problem, and it starts at the level of the landowner and makes its way all the way up to the community when you consider golf courses and developments, homeowners associations. Those decisions should be able to be made locally.
Okay. Does the SEEP idea of moving water south anticipate the purchase or condemnation of sugarlands?
One of the constraints of SEP from the very beginning was to use existing state-owned lands. It didn't include any of the U.S. sugar lands or any other agricultural lands that were not in control by the state. So we were confined essentially to the Talisman A2 parcel, because the A1 parcel was to be used as a feature in the restoration strategies plan, although it will be connected to some extent with the SEP flow equalization basin.
Okay. On a different track, what impact does rising sea level have on the restoration plans?
It just means we need to take action quicker. By having a system that's deprived of fresh water now, we've only made our coastal areas more vulnerable to sea level rise and storm surge impacts. One of the projects, the scientific projects that I'm currently working on, is looking at how those storm surge additions of salt to otherwise fresh wetland soils are affecting the loss of that soil and the conversion to different vegetation, primarily salt marsh or mangrove. And so we know that in the natural system we had a lot more fresh water moving through the system, and so by restoring fresh water back, we make the system less vulnerable. But at the same time, we need to recognize that it's the water supply for the region, and we know that some of our coastal wells are becoming more and more saline. We also know that with increasing sea level rise, our flood control infrastructure will be less efficient. So there are decisions that need to be made now to ensure that we have not only a healthy ecosystem in the future, but also an operable water supply and flood control infrastructure.
Okay. Who is responsible for buying the SERP land slated to be restored to natural wetlands in St. Lucie County? They're saying there's supposed to be about 90,000 plus acres to be purchased. Do you have any information on specific projects like that?
If it's in reference to the SERP project, then they would be state. That would be the responsibility of the state.
Okay. A big picture question here. Do you see a day in Florida's future when water flows directly from Lake Okeechobee through the Everglades agricultural area lands and then south as a more natural surface flow without multiple stormwater treatment areas, etc.?
Well, with that last caveat, I don't think I'll see that in my lifetime. I think we're going to need more stormwater treatment area well into the future as we bring more water south. Now, with regard to the first part of that question, I'll be 43 next week, and I hope to see water flowing directly from the lake into the Everglades protection area all the way down to Florida Bay at some point in my lifetime.
Okay. Let me see. We've got a number of other questions here, and I'm trying to not ask duplicate questions. The South Florida Water Management District is currently considering bids from the agricultural community for the Northern Everglades for Ecosystems Project. Is the foundation encouraging expansion of storage above Lake Okeechobee, and if so, in what way?
Well, from the perspective of using that land to temporarily store water as it did historically, and recognizing that there would be some water quality benefits of that, absolutely, we would support that.
Okay. What impact do the proposed projects have on groundwater, aquifer recharge, and water conservation overall?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
What impact does it have on groundwater recharge and aquifer overall, these projects?
Well, anytime you can put more water back into southern Everglades, with our geology down here being a porous limestone rock, many people have this view of the Everglades as just being a flowing ecosystem. Well, for every amount of water that flows to the south through the Everglades, we also have water that flows down into the aquifer. And many folks have probably heard the legends of coastal freshwater springs, where boats would come up and with their buckets get fresh water from an otherwise saltwater body. We know that that was the case. We know that by putting more water back in the system, we increasingly push that saltwater wedge back out to sea. How effective we are at that, I'm not sure, but that's for groundwater hydrologists to decide. But we do know that by putting more water back into the Everglades, we increase aquifer recharge.
Okay. What are the options for cleaning Lake Okeechobee itself? Can the nitrogen and phosphorus already deposited realistically be removed and or treated?
Well, there have been ideas to dredge the lake, remove the sediments that have accumulated in there that are extremely rich in phosphorus and nitrogen. I think that is cost prohibitive and would also do significant ecological harm to the lake just by the physical disruption of those sediments. I think we're going to be living with that legacy phosphorus for quite some time, and that's probably the reason why we're going to continue to need stormwater treatment or water flowing south for a generation or more. At the same time, we need to work to tackle the problem of increasing that legacy effect in the lake by controlling the amount of phosphorus coming down the Kissimmee.
Okay. We have a question about your slide about what the Everglades look like historically and what it looks like under SERP. And they're asking, is the large disparity between the size of the historical image versus SERP due to the amount of existing development that can't be displaced, or lack of funding, or some other reason? Yeah, I think it's that image.
Yeah. The reality is we have a significant and dense population of people adjacent to the Everglades. We've lost about 50% of the footprint of the Everglades that we're never going to get back. What we can do is mimic the functioning of the ecosystem in a restored state. We can improve sheet flow throughout the system by removing barriers to flow that exist within the system. At the same time, we need to continue to provide water supply for agriculture, for these urban communities, etc. So we're never going to achieve that depiction of the natural state, but we can certainly achieve a functioning of that natural state and increase the flow to the south water conservation areas in Everglades National Park.
How long is it estimated to complete SERP?
Well, the reality is it's probably going to take longer than we thought. The implementation timeline right now for, just as an example, the Restoration Strategies Plan, which is the state's plan to clean up the existing flow of water into the Everglades Protection Area, is not slated for completion until 2025. The Central Everglades Planning Project, the timeline for that is over a decade, and we haven't even gotten authorization for that project, let alone an appropriation. The same goes for some of the other projects. We hope that we'll see implementation of these projects over the next few decades. So we're looking at least a 20-year window right now.
In terms of the problems now facing the Indian River Lagoon, what is a timeline for remedies for those if it's not short term?
Well, it's going to be on a scale of a decade or more. As we get the C-44 implemented, we can see some more improvement as they make progress on their basin management, particularly the water quality issue, because it's really, there's a need to keep an eye on both those issues, and that's something that needs to be tackled soon as well. So you could see significant progress in the next decade or more.
Okay. What will be the effect of these plans on Florida Bay?
Well, the Central Everglades Planning Project is an example of sending flow to the south. The screening process for the tentatively selected plan identified a significant improvement in Florida Bay salinity, a measurable improvement of 2 to 3 parts per thousand on average across the bay. So that just indicates that by moving flow to the south and removing those barriers, we can get that water all the way down to Florida Bay and improve that estuary and its fisheries habitat, wading bird habitat, etc.
We've gotten several comments in kind of dismayed over the length of time to bring about change. Is there anything that can be done to speed the process up, either politically or through funding?
As a scientist, I'm looking at the projects and the timeline for implementation of these large-scale, long-term projects, and that is the realistic timeline. It's the local watershed management. Those are the decisions that are kind of a wild card and could be, you can see decisions made on the short term. When C-44 is completed, there's going to be an immediate benefit of that. And the same goes for C-43. Once we get that Chief's report in this next Water Resource Development Act, the funding could be made available soon. We hope to see some of the Gulf Restore funding made available for that project. That's a prime example of a project where we could see immediate benefits to a Gulf Coast estuary in a very short term. So there are decisions that can be made, money that can be made available sooner than later that could certainly change that timeline and make it much shorter.
Okay. What role do isolated wetlands play in restoration?
I'm going to have to read some into that question. Isolated wetlands are critical, particularly in a floodplain like the Kissimmee Valley. What they provide when you have a natural river flood regime occurring, these isolated pockets across the landscape ultimately become connected and provide important fisheries habitat, wading bird habitat, and so their role is only enhanced through restoration, in this case of the Kissimmee River, because you now make these habitats that weren't connected to the river. Now they're periodically connected as they once were, so they become extremely important. In more urbanized areas, isolated wetlands serve an invaluable service in terms of floodwater mitigation, water quality enhancement, etc. We know that the loss of isolated wetlands in more urban landscapes is directly related to flood risk. So they're important there as well.
I think this relates to the whole timing issue. There's a question about limited eminent domain. Is that feasible?
I can't speak to that. I know probably just as much as the person asking that question.
Okay. Let me see, we've got several more questions here. How far south will the high nutrient water travel before it is acceptable for the Everglades?
Well, in the current situation where we're not cleaning it sufficiently to meet that 10 part per billion threshold, you really just need to track the change in cattail area as an indication. So as we see a conversion of sawgrass habitat, ridge and slough habitat to cattail, that means that the phosphorus-rich plume is moving further and further downstream. And so it's creating irreversible harm. At the same time, it's indicating that the phosphorus that we're polluting it with is making it further and further into the ecosystem.
There's a related question about how detrimental this is to the Everglades.
That is the point I made about irreversible harm. That's exactly it. Once you get phosphorus into an ecosystem like the Everglades, there's really no natural way of remediating it. It gets tied up in the plants, it gets tied up in the soil, and so without physically going in and disrupting the habitat, removing the plant and soil matter, the phosphorus is going to be there, and it's gradually going to bleed downstream and continue impacting well beyond the point that we are able to clean up the water. So that just speaks to the need to curtail our phosphorus pollution now rather than later.
There's also a question about the EAA and the input of sulfur. Can you address sulfur pollution?
Yeah, sulfur is an issue, particularly as it relates to mercury availability. And as a large precipitation-fed wetland, the Everglades is vulnerable to deposition of mercury within that area. Mercury itself is not so much a problem in a natural system like the Everglades. In the presence of sulfate and in the natural conditions of a wetland, sulfate helps to catalyze the conversion of that elemental mercury into a much more toxic and bioaccumulative form called methylmercury. Sulfate has been used on agricultural lands to help make the soil conditions more favorable for plant growth and to help release phosphorus and make it more available in addition to the phosphorus fertilizer they use. So that sulfate has been bleeding off of those agricultural lands for quite some time. And with this mercury that's been deposited through the industrial, or since the Industrial Revolution in the Everglades, we've seen an increase catalysis of that conversion from elemental mercury to methylmercury. And that's, as I mentioned earlier, that's the form that bioaccumulates and is highly toxic to wildlife.
Okay. On a related topic, is there a program in place to relieve nitrogen, phosphorus, and animal waste flowing into Lake Okeechobee?
Yes, and that's part of the Lake Okeechobee Protection Plan and means for reducing those loads has been laid out as part of that plan in terms of agricultural best management practices, in addition to restoration projects that will recreate more natural riparian wetland zones along the river to help remove that phosphorus.
Okay. Does SERP include any efforts to stabilize or improve the dike around Lake Okeechobee?
That's a non-SERP effort, but obviously the stability of the dike and the lake regulation schedule directly affects management of water throughout the district and certainly affects the ability to move water where we want it to go.
Okay. One of your colleagues has estimated that about 1 million acre-feet of water storage is needed. If that's correct, where can this happen?
Well, it can happen in the Everglades agricultural area, and many folks probably know that we have options on U.S. sugar lands in the EAA, and certainly that would be the most viable place to move that water and store it and ultimately treat it. It's just right now it's cost prohibitive, looking at another $1 billion just for the land. And we also know that once we have that land, it's very costly to construct surface reservoirs and the treatment needed with the construction of stormwater treatment areas. Those are costly features. So you're looking at probably doubling that or more just to begin to move more of that water into storage.
Okay, and we have one final question. What can citizens do to try to bring greater attention to this issue and get things moving forward faster?
Well, I hope that today was a positive step in that direction. I think talking and educating yourself on these issues, I mentioned some of our fact sheets. That's a good place to start. Other sources of information are websites for the South Florida Water Management District. The Army Corps of Engineers maintains the Everglades Plan website. I think those are great sources of information. The Central Everglades Planning Project, I know for a lot of the public and stakeholders that attended the meetings, they found them very effective in terms of conveying information, and then also allowed them to participate in the process of restoration planning. And just by participating and attending, there was more of a sense of involvement. And I think, you know, those kinds of incremental steps just lead to more of an understanding of how to get involved, whether it's through your county commission or at the state level or through the different environmental organizations that are working to restore the Everglades, many of which are part of the Everglades Coalition. So I encourage folks to get involved at any of those levels.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for an outstanding presentation on this issue. And just for people's information, the PowerPoint is posted on 1000 Friends website at 1000friendsofflorida.org. And early next week, a broadcast of this presentation will be included. So thank you very much, Stephen. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Goodbye.
Bye.